Well, U.S. markets opened sharply lower after the U.S. administration of President Donald Trump signaled a determination to continue with its tariff policy. This as financial services institution J.P. Morgan raised its likelihood of a U.S. recession in 2025 from 40% to 60% just late last week. For more on this, let's take you live to New York and welcome SABC U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, a very good afternoon. Good to have you with us. So the markets in the United States opened just over about 30 minutes ago. What are you currently seeing given the broad losses that we have seen already in other regions of the world, including Asia, Africa, as well as Europe?
Well, it's a trend, Alicia, that I can tell you is continuing. Unfortunately, I do not have good news for you. The markets are down sharply this morning here on Wall Street in New York. Let me just give you the latest numbers. The Dow Jones is currently, these are the very latest numbers, down over 1,000 points. It had already been down about 1,500 points earlier today. The S&P 100 is currently down 2.2%. 3%, the Nasdaq composite down 1.67, and remember, this comes, Alicia, on top of the lower closings we saw on Wall Street on Thursday and Friday last week. Of course, the immediate reaction to that Wednesday announcement of so-called reciprocal tariffs, which in terms of the data turns out to not be reciprocal, but also based on trade deficits that the United States has with various countries, including South Africa. I'll tell you another fact here. There's something called the VIX index, which is essentially Wall Street's fear gauge. The fear gauge is above 50 points today on the index, and we are told that fear gauge has only closed above 50 on three previous occasions. The other occasions was in the last 2 decades was in 2008, 2009, during the height of the global recession, right? Just at the time when Barack Obama was coming into office. You remember there was a global recession. Banks were failing. Too big to fail was a term that we became accustomed to. And the other time that this index reached above 50%, I'll give you one guess. It was in early 2020, during the height of the corona virus pandemic induced sell-off on global markets. So that's the stage we're in terms of these Trump tariffs, equal to in terms of the fear gauge to what we experienced in 2008, 2009, and during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. And that tells you exactly the sentiment that investors are feeling right now, the fear that investors are feeling right now, and of course the uncertainty, right? Because we've seen some retaliatory tariffs from places like China. We still haven't heard from the likes of the European Union. You talk about that Luxembourg meeting among trade ministers today. Of course, there'll be a vote within the EU later this week in terms of how they're going to retaliate. And as President Ramaphosa said in that bite, do not act out of spite or emotion. This is what you're seeing from major players. They are taking their time here. They're evaluating how they're going to impose the greatest pain on American consumers and traders and farmers. And maybe that will be able to influence a rethink here from the Trump administration, which does not appear to be the case right now. And that's why the markets are responding as they are.
I mean, let's talk about that, Sherwin. President Trump likely under some pressure now, given, of course, the negative sentiment around his tariffs and the uncertainty that it has brought. What is he saying today? I'm looking at an article that says he possibly could be ready to talk as new stock market losses fuel tariff chaos.
Well, his Treasury Secretary over the weekend doing the Sunday shows talked about how more than 50 countries had already reached out to the White House, Japan among them. We know South Africa has indicated a desire through Parks Tao, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, to really try and come with new deals in terms of, the deal-making nature, the transactional nature of this president, the back and forth that one assumes will be happening now. But remember, countries have been open. The EU, for example, blocs like the EU have been signaling that they had a desire to negotiate before the tariffs were imposed. That, of course, hasn't happened. And the posture, certainly from Trump administration officials, including the president himself, is that these tariffs are not going to be going away anytime soon, that this is a policy that the president is going to hunker down on. I'll tell you what he's saying on his Truth Social media platform. Remember, when the president posts on social media a lot, it tends to be because he's a little bit under pressure, and that will be certainly indicative of the situation you are seeing playing itself out on the markets right now. This is what he said today. on Truth Social, quote, "We have massive financial deficits with China, the European Union and many others. The only way this problem can be cured is with tariffs, which are now bringing tens of billions of dollars into the USA. They are already in effect and a beautiful thing to behold." The markets, of course, do not agree, right? This was another one. Countries from all over the world are talking to us. Tough but fair parameters are being set. I spoke to the Japanese Prime Minister this morning. He's sending a top team to negotiate. They have treated the US very poorly on trade. They don't take our cars, but we take millions of theirs. Likewise, agriculture, many other things. It has to change, but especially with China. The last 1 year, the United States has a chance to do something that should have been done decades ago. Don't be weak. Don't be stupid. Don't be a panican, which he says in brackets is a new party based on weak and stupid people. Be strong, courageous and patient, and greatness will be the result. Right? Time will tell if greatness will be the result. What we are seeing now is a desire to negotiate. Maybe the Trump administration will use these tariffs as leverage. But his stated goal here is to reduce the U.S. deficit that it has with several countries, and he believes that imposing tariffs is the way to do that. What economists writ large tell us is imposing tariffs on imports to the United States then transfers a cost to the consumer in the United States. So the Federal Reserve is concerned in the United States that prices are going to go up. This might lead to inflation, and they are taking a very cautious approach here because they don't know how this is going to play out. And I think anybody in the Trump administration that can tell you with any certainty that they know how these tariff impositions and the reciprocal tariffs and responses you're going to see around the world, that they know how this is going to play out simply is not going to be based in fact.
Absolutely. A very quick one, Sherwin. Of course, we saw the massive protests around the country over the weekend as tens of thousands across the United States actually protested these policies from the president. How is this development being digested? Because we understand earlier as well that a group of finance as well as tech leaders were heading to Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort to talk some sense into him about these tariffs.
Look, the protest movement we saw in the United States had been building since this president came into office on January 19th this year. But I will take you back a few years to when, 2016, right after 2016, Donald Trump gets elected. What did we see the day after Donald Trump was elected was inaugurated, in 2017? Massive protests in Washington, D.C. against the president's agenda and you're seeing that play itself out again. Why? There has been, crazy, some would call them crazy government cuts in terms of spending locally, in terms of foreign aid, in terms of cutting federal staffing within the federal government, and the list goes on. And now the tariffs was really what spurred tens of thousands of people in New York, in Washington, D.C., across the country, in San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, massive protests in Boston. And so you're seeing a growing opposition to this president on the streets of the United States. The question you must ask yourself, are those just Democrats? Because, they turned up and lost the election in 2024. Are these just Democrats turning up and venting their frustration? Or is this a growing sort of surge of people, maybe Republicans, middle-of-the-road Republicans, independents that voted for the president in 2024, and now they are expressing their frustration? Those numbers need to settle before we get a really good sense of what these protests really mean. But we are seeing growing resistance to the agenda of this president, and that's what you saw on the streets of the United States over the weekend.
Thank you so much for that update. SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York for us.